I know this. I'm going into your lunchtime, and I'm thankful that you're staying. It's wonderful to be here in Saipan today. I'd like to thank Northern Marianas Humanities Council, particularly Mr. Scott Russell, for bringing me over here. I'm not a military historian. I study historical memory and cultural studies of tourism. So my task is not so much about what happened in 1944, but as in the subtitle of this conference, there's afterward, and I'm going to be focusing on afterward part. My point here today is pretty simple. I want to connect this kind of serious-looking dark room with what's happening outside. Once you step outside, there's swimming pool and full of tourists out there. And there seems to be a kind of disconnect between what we're talking about here and what's happening out there. But I want to sort of make a case of trying to connect the two. How tourism impacts the ways in which the past is remembered, especially the war is remembered in a place like Saipan. I've been focusing on Hawaii over the last 10 years or so, and in my abstract I said I was going to compare the situation here with Hawaii, but for the sake of time I'm going to focus mostly on Saipan. Before I left Japan, I left on Thursday, we're still in the middle of the semester, so I was teaching. And as I was finishing my class, I told my students, oh, I'm going to Saipan. And the reaction I got from them was, ine, which loosely translates as, oh, we're jealous. And I said, well, you're jealous, but do you know why I'm going to Saipan? And they kind of discussed and said, oh, you probably like to scuba dive or snorkel. But I had to tell them that I was coming for a conference, and I asked them, I asked them to guess what conference it was. And these are mostly humanities and social science students, and I teach at a very elite university in Tokyo. These are supposedly very smart students who have come through a very rigorous entrance exam system. But no one could really guess until I told them, this is June 2014. Well, still they couldn't guess. And then I told them, the Battle of Saipan, and then they remembered, and then they could make this connection between my going to Saipan and the conference being held. This is not really their fault. It's mainly the fault of the Japanese secondary school education that de-emphasizes the Japanese colonial period in the Pacific Islands. So the students don't learn much about it. Instead, their image of Saipan is that of a tropical paradise. And indeed, I think that is the general perception of Saipan and Northern Marianas today in Japan. I picked up a travel brochure before I left, and this is published by Japan Travel Bureau, which is the largest travel agency in Japan. And if you look at the cover, it's blue, and in the middle is this uninhabited island, Manyaga Island, and there's a cocktail and hibiscus flower and banana boat and whatnot. And there are 64 pages on Saipan Island. Even though it says Saipan, there is an entry on Tinian and there is an entry on Rota. But Saipan comprises of 64 pages. 14 pages on marine sports activities, 3 pages on on-land activities like trekking and kayaking, and then 10 pages on food, 4 pages on shopping, and then there are some pages dedicated to Agarapan and Spin, and 2 pages on history. There's also a calendar of events in Northern Marianas. So I looked at the June part, and this is what it says. April to June, this is the best season for flowers. In addition to bougainville flowers, which you can see throughout the year, you'll be able to enjoy mango flowers from April to June. So June is a good time to come for the Japanese if they want to enjoy mango flowers. And then there's also reference to Seaside Grill Beach Volley Tournament. And end of June, there's Rota Cliff Fishing Derby. Lest you think this is an anomaly, I did some research online, and another large travel agency in Japan is called HIS. And if you go to HIS webpage, here's what you see. And the description of Saipan is as this: all summer resort island with very easy access from Japan, surrounded by clear water and untouched nature. Tetsukazuno, she said, untouched nature, where time flows slowly. So this is the kind of image of Saipan that's pervasive in Japan, and it's to a large extent, I think it's endorsed by the Northern Marianas government as well, because if you look at the website of Mariana Travel Bureau, this is what it says, and this is my translation. It says, once upon a time, people arrived in small southern sea islands after navigating the ocean. After thousands of years, the islands became a place of simple life, nurtured by the history and culture of their ancestors, a moderate climate, and great nature. Today, Saipan, Tinian, and Rota are gentle paradise to the travelers. Various marine sports for beginners. For golfers, golf courses with a commanding view of the ocean where one can move about using golf carts. Apparently, people can't really have the use of golf carts in Japan, so that's apparently an attraction. For those wishing to relax, healing time in the spa. After an active day of playing, you can cool down watching the calm sea and the red sunset in the sky. This is a fun resort filled with Hafadai spirits. Why don't you come and enjoy the Northern Marianas Islands? So this is what it says. So let's get back to the war memory or history parts in the JTB publishing book. 2 pages on Saipan history, and the references to history sites. It says, the history sites in Saipan are surrounded by the blue ocean and grand nature. Yudaina Shizen. And then it says, Saipan was a site of fierce battle in the Pacific War. In this beautiful island are spots where one can learn about the atrocious history that took place on this stage. Why don't you visit those precious historical places along with beautiful nature, grand nature? And it lists Bonsai Cliffs, Suicide Cliff, last command post with photographs, and Japanese Shale, and other sites like Mount Carmel Cathedral, St. Louis Shrine, Grotto, and Bird Island. So the question is, there's this very strong image of tropical island resort, and also the militarized past, and also present to some extent. And the question is, have the Japanese forgotten what happened in 1944, June 1940? Well, if they have forgotten it, it would be a simpler story. But as the 2-page description suggests, they have not forgotten. And the juxtaposition between the image of tropical island and marginalizing of the reference to wartime past may make it seem the Japanese are forgetting the past. But my sense is that this is not necessarily the case, because a visit to the northern part of the island, to the so-called Bonsai Cliff and Suicide Cliff, will show a line of Japanese memorials and a flow of tourists from Japan. Some are specifically here to pray for the dead, nire in Japanese, but there are others who take half a day or a day off from their day at the beach and come to see the memorial. The fact that my students understood the significance of my visit to Saipan once I told them is indicative of the lack of awareness, but at the same time, the presence of knowledge about the dead in Saipan. And this is exemplified by the visit by Japanese Emperor in June of 2005. This was the first ever memorial visit by the Japanese Emperor abroad. So Saipan was chosen amongst other places. And excuse me for this Japanese quote, but this is from a statement he made prior to his departure, and he said he was going to remember the dead in Saipan, including the Japanese 55,000 Japanese, including 12,000 children, He also mentioned the American military personnel, 3,500 American military personnel, and also 900 islanders, including innocent children. So these are the people he mentioned. And he went to the Japanese memorial, government memorial. He also went to the American Memorial Park. He stopped at the Mariana Memorial. He also stopped at Okinawa Memorial. And he also stopped at the Korean Memorial. Now this stop, the final stop at the Korean Memorial, was unannounced. He made sure all the journalists went back to the hotel to wait for him. And then he apparently insisted that he stop at the Korean Memorial. But no one was able to capture him stopping at the Korean Memorial because it would have caused a huge controversy back in Japan. So I think it would be misleading to say that the Japanese are forgetting the Battle of Saipan. But how should we then understand sort of foregrounding of the tropical image and at the same time the sort of lack of awareness of June of 1945? So how should we understand the significance of say, the memorials in the northern part of the island? I think, in fact, these memorials in the northern part of the island need to be understood as not something opposed to their sort of sense, the traveler's sense of pleasure on tropical island, but rather connected to their time in this tropical paradise. That is, the image of beautiful paradise enhances the tragedy of the death here. The death are beautified by the image of the blue ocean and grand nature in a faraway, isolated island. The beauty of the tropical island serves to enhance the innocence and its former inhabitants from Japan as tragic victims in this what they call remote, beautiful island. And the dead in turn give way to Saipan because they frame the island not as a site of simple pleasure, but also a site of serious commemoration and contemplation. So they can take half a day off and they can do their history lesson and they go back to the beach. The fact that this island was developed as a sugar plantation by destroying nature, and during the war, the island was fully fortified, that those facts are lost from them because the remnant of that era is not visible to these people. However, obviously there are significant problems with this way of framing the past, which is not uncommon at all actually, especially in war sites and resort areas such as Saipan in Hawaii. First is that it narrows the temporal scope of the memory by abstracting the death and contextualizing them within the contemporary touristic pleasure and experience. As a result, the process leading up to June 1944 becomes de-emphasized. Saipan Tochi, which means Saipan rule, and they never say Saipan Shokuminchi or Mariana Shokuminchi, they always say Saipan rule. Shokuminchi being colony. There are references to Saipan Tochi, but its meaning is not fully explained in any of the travel brochures. Japanese colonialism, the very reason for the battle in June 1944, is largely ignored. It's as though the Japanese were living in this paradise and suddenly had to die amidst this beautiful nature. Thus, pre-Japanese eras are erased, except for references to ancient Chamorro practice and culture. And there's quite a bit of references to ancient Chamorro practices. And then there's nothing about the colonial period and suddenly about the death of the Japanese. The devastation of natural environment during the colonial period, as well as during the battle, is always completely overlooked. And it's as though the Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff have always been that way, peaceful, quiet, and green, which is not the case. The post-Japanese eras, including the use of these islands as a launching site for many of the 29 plans to bomb Japanese cities, or including Hiroshima and Nagasaki, go unmentioned. This way of seeing the past also narrows the scope of geographic and demographic focus, because the tragedy is always claimed to be that of Japanese. According to the JTB book, Banzai Cliff is the place where Japanese soldiers and civilians jumped off shouting Banzai. Suicide Cliff is where many Japanese jumped off to kill themselves. So the tragedy is always associated with Japanese. Of course, there are memorials such as this one up on the Suicide Hill that tries to commemorate the Japanese, the Chamorros, and Americans. And also the visit by Emperor Akihito is significant. But it's also important that he had to stop at the Korean memorial unannounced. And the media report in Japan were heavily about the emperor's visit to the Japanese memorial. Nothing about, very little about other aspects. So going back to the memorial in the northern part of the island, and these are all private memorials. These private memorials are inscribed only in Japanese language. No English, no Chamorro, or no Korean. Though the Japanese government memorial has English and Chamorro language. Like this one, a private memorial, the inscription here says, "The hero spirit that sleeps here in this remotest island, Saihate no Shima. Oh, the respectful soul, let us return home." So the statement here does not dwell on the combat at all, but the sadness of being away from home and cut off in this so-called remotest island. Now this kind of dedication is effective to many Japanese because it's seen by those who are here for only a few days on vacation and were able to return home, and then they see these souls who should not belong here and who are abandoned here. That is, somehow again, there's no context explained here, that these souls are stuck in this remote, beautiful island, and they need to be returned home. And that really deepens the sadness of the Japanese, partly because, or mainly because they are here on vacation and they're having a great time. And they come here and they see these souls stuck in a remote island. So this is a quick example of the ways in which how historical memory is intimately related to tourism. In fact, the forces and demand of tourism often dictate what I remember. And in the last half of the, last 5-10 minutes of the presentation, I want to sort of think about the future of historical memory and tourism in Saipan. This is because I see the demographic of tourists in Saipan changing very rapidly. Obviously, there is steady decline of tourism from Japan, rapid increase from Korea. I understand this is a Korean-owned hotel, and seems like most of the visitors here are either Korean or Chinese. And if you go to the front desk, there are 4 clocks. One's indicating Saipan, another's New York. The other 2 are Beijing and Seoul. No Tokyo time. There's rapid increase of Chinese tourists. And already by 3 years ago, there were more Koreans coming than Japanese. And maybe there are more Chinese here than Japanese, but I'm not quite sure. And everywhere in the tourist brochure, there's this call for the need to satisfy the demand of the Chinese. For example, there was a broadcast in Radio Australia that said Pacific tourism must change to meet Chinese requirements. Things have to change to meet the specific needs of the Chinese market. So if Saipan wants to survive as a tourist paradise, it really has to address the needs of the Koreans and the Chinese. So what does arrival of tourists from Korea and China mean for memorializing the past? And there's also a sizable immigrant population from the Philippines. What does that mean? Yesterday I was at the Korean memorial and they were having a ceremony. I don't speak Korean, so I'm not quite sure what the ceremony or what was being said in the ceremony, but there's a group of Koreans at the memorial. How should these quote-unquote new arrivals be informed of the past? How should they remember the war through memorials and museums? What should or would be inserted in the memorial complex of the island? Right now, most of them are Japanese and Americans, but with the arrival of Chinese and Koreans, what will happen or what will not happen? The kinds of past that would emerge as a result, what would they be? Will it be a beautiful merger, or disconnect, or tension, conflict, or chaos? What if there was a demand for Korean comfort women memorial in Saipan? Because there were Korean comfort women, and already, as you know, in the United States, these memorials are being established. But if one establishes a Korean comfort women memorial in the United States, in the U.S. mainland, don't you need to have more here in Saipan? Because they were here. But what would be the reaction of the Japanese tourists and the Japanese government? So please allow me to finish this presentation with a series of questions. If tourism casts a significant impact on the formation of war memory, in fact, it's integral to a place like the Northern Marianas will inevitably face the question of what kinds of past should be foregrounded and for what purpose. Up until now, perhaps it was a bit more simple. There were local islanders, Marianas people, and Americans, and the Japanese tourists, who were also interested in finding a particular kind of past. And their memorization of the past has been made possible, if not tolerated, by a willing collaboration of the local government and residents who had a variety of interests in not only financial, but more philanthropic, working with the Japanese, thereby producing the kind of memorial complex one sees along the Banzai Cliff. The Banzai Cliff memorials are all private memorials, and that it is possible for Japanese to establish those are pretty remarkable. But how will that memory landscape change in the future, in line with the changing demand of tourism? Tourism has the power to not only confirm, but also construct a particular version of the past. In a place like Northern Marianas, this is posed as a significant question. If it were to continue to confront the war memory while promoting tourism from the areas that they have, from the areas that have very different kinds of historical memory from that of Japan. Thank you.
So my presentation today was from Chapter 2 of my dissertation, which examines Chamorro land stewardship and military land taking on Guam. The research for this chapter and my dissertation comes from archives in Guam, California, Maryland, the Philippines, and Washington, D.C. I also supplemented the archival research with 35 oral histories that I conducted from 2012 to 2013. So the three major questions that I was asking in my project was, how did the U.S. military expansion of Guam impact Chamorro land stewardship before and after World War II? What was the process of military land taking? And how did Chamorros respond to military land acquisition? Some of the main goals and arguments of my project was to utilize the term stewardship to describe the complex relationship between Chamorros and the land, since Chamorros were not just landowners. The Chamorro relationship to land is also best characterized as one of continuity and change, and disrupting the liberation of land narrative provides a more comprehensive understanding of military land taking of Guam. And finally, military land acquisition resulted in the creation of Chamorro grassroots activism that was critical of the military in the 1960s and 1970s. The historical background for my project, looking at Chamorros and land in the pre-contact and in the Spanish period, was that for Chamorros, land and by extension the ocean was a source of ancestral lineage, cultural perpetuation, and subsistence. This was no more evident than in the pre-European contact era. Land on Guam was vested in control of Chamorro family clans. This controlled stewardship over communal resources was based on extended family and was predicated on matrilineal descent. Even though they did not conceive of land as individual private property, they did protect their family lands against other clans, which meant they understood exclusive communal property. In addition, Chamorros relied on the ocean and land to hunt, grow, and gather food for self-subsistence. However, the indigenous concept of communal land stewardship would be altered under the Spanish colonization of Guam. The reduction of Chamorro villages after the Spanish-Chamorro Wars provided the political stability that allowed the Spanish government to implement the practice of individual land ownership. Even though most Chamorros lost access to large communal lands, many of them were able to obtain smaller plots of land for farming and ranching called lanchos. The lancho system was an integral part of Chamorro society, because it provided space for continued practices of cultural perpetuation, ancestral veneration, and subsistence outside of the Spanish surveillance. During the week, Chamorros were permitted to live and work on their lanchos, provided that they returned to their residences during the weekends to attend church. Ultimately, the lancho system continued throughout the Spanish occupation of Guam and into the American period. While the U.S. Navy did assert its control over how land was transferred on Guam, it did not radically alter the basic practices of land stewardship that existed under the Spanish regime. For example, Chamorros continued to cultivate agricultural goods for self-subsistence, even though the U.S. Navy encouraged Chamorros to sell their produce. Even though some Chamorro men had jobs in the pre-war period, this money was used to pay for property tax and to buy imported goods from the United States. Thus, being a steward of the land was more important than wage labor because that's how they survived. That's how the families on Guam survived. The lancho system also continued to provide the space necessary for the perpetuation and maintenance of family and clan relationships in the pre-war era, as it did under the Spanish period. Chamorros continued to utilize the lancho as a space to socialize with family members over food, music, singing, storytelling, and other activities that cultivated their kinship bonds. Ultimately, the lancho was an integral part of the Chamorro social fabric, since it provided both physical and spiritual subsistence. The Japanese occupation of Guam linked Chamorros to the land through their mandated worker roles in constructing airfields, fortifications, and as farmers. For these Chamorro children and adults, their relationship to the land was no longer simply based on stewardship and lineage, but one that was linked their labor to the land. Many of them were forced to work long, grueling days, clearing fields, dragging large rocks, and planting crops. Alberto Akval recalled working at Tidzin and described the conditions he and others endured. Quote, "At the time it was all jungle and big rocks, and it had to be removed from the area so that airplanes could land and take off. As we worked in Tidzin, some people got sick because they were working in the rain, and on sunny days, we worked in the heat of the sun. They would build a fire out of dead coconut leaves, which gave us light and warmth, but some men were already sick because of the constant heat and wetness. Some were so weak that they could not even carry their own bodies." The late Ben Bloss also worked at Tidzin as a young boy. Bloss stated, "So when the airstrip was finished, it was not possible to simply dismiss it as something we were forced to do. All of us looked at it with a kind of pride of proprietorship. It was ours, we had made it, and then we'd be struck by what the Japanese intended to use it for, and the emotional conflicts would tear us again." Maintenance of family and clan relationships in the pre-war era, as it did under the Spanish colonial period. Chamorros continued to utilize the lancho as a space to socialize with family members over food, music, singing, storytelling, and other activities that cultivated their kinship bonds. Ultimately, the lancho was an integral part of the Chamorro social fabric since it provided both physical and spiritual subsistence. The Japanese occupation of Guam linked Chamorros to the land through their mandated worker roles in constructing airfields, fortifications, and as farmers. For these Chamorro children and adults, their relationship to the land was no longer simply based on stewardship and ancestral lineage, but one that linked their labor to the land. Many of them were forced to work long, grueling days, clearing fields, dragging large rocks, planting crops. Alberto Akval recalled working at Tidzin and described the conditions he and others endured. Quote, "At the time, it was all jungle and big rocks. Had to be moved from the area so that airplanes could land and take off. As we worked in Tidzin, some people got sick because we were working in the rain, and on sunny days, we worked in the heat of the sun. They would build a fire out of dead coconut leaves, which gave us light and warmth, but some men were already sick because of the constant heat and wetness. Some were so weak that they could not even carry their own bodies." End quote. The late Ben Bloss also worked at Tidzin as a young boy. Bloss stated, "So when the airstrip was finished, it was not possible to simply dismiss it as something we were forced to do. All of us looked at it with a kind of pride of proprietorship.
It was ours. We had made it. And then we'd be struck by what the Japanese intended to use it for, and the emotional conflicts would tear us once again. Now, Bloss's memories underscore the complex emotions that he and other Chamorros felt as a result of as being used as compulsory military labor. For many Chamorros, their sickness and death was due to the intense manual labor and working conditions. For those that survived, the memories of working the land remained with them years after the war. For the Chamorros of Akfal and Bloss's generation, Tidzin, Manengan, and other sites on Guam are a constant reminder of how the blood, sweat, pain, and for some, death are linked to the land. By July 1944, life under Japanese occupation was coming to an end with the impending invasion of American forces. The proliferation of U.S. military expansion in the post-war era drastically altered Chamorro land stewardship. Specifically, Guam and other Pacific islands had become important to the development of American bases in the Western Pacific. In order to implement their plan for base development, access to large tracts of land were necessary. In Guam, the occupying of privately owned land on Guam was at times a seamless process, especially since many Chamorros had been displaced from their homes during the Japanese invasion in 1941 or due to combat between American forces in American and Japanese forces in 1944. The bombing of Guam resulted in large-scale devastation of entire villages such as Hagatna. By August 1945, the U.S. government owned approximately 75% of all privately owned land on Guam. Instead of returning the land to the respective owners, the Navy continued to use these properties for military purposes. In order to resolve this and other war-related issues, the U.S. Congress passed several public laws, including the Meritorious Claim Act of 1945. This result of these public laws were the U.S. Navy's creation of the Guam Land and Claims Commission, also known as the GLCC. Created in 1945, the GLCC was a primary legal institution that was authorized to appraise and evaluate land on Guam and to evaluate property boundaries on the island. The naval governor appointed various naval officers to act as members of the commission. This authority created an inherent conflict of interest since the naval governor had the power to appoint commission officials who were also naval officers. Thus, the commission officers were not civilians but actually military officers who had a dilemma in balancing their roles as military officers while also trying to be fair towards landowners on Guam. The GLCC also had several functions. Its most important purposes was to appraise property value, provide compensation for property damage and or loss, and to give compensation for death or injury that came as a result of the American invasion of Guam. The GLCC, however, the judiciousness of commission officials determined the consistency in the process of land appraisal, evaluation, and acquisition. The GLCC usually sent a negotiator, appraiser, and a Chamorro interpreter to notify owners that their lands had been taken and gave them offers to settle based on the appraisal of their property. Thus, some Chamorros actually acted as agents of the GLCC and helped the military take advantage of many landowners who were not linguistically or educationally equipped to understand this complex legal process and protocol involved with the taking of their land. For some, this was an intimidating and fearful experience, especially since the people of Guam had just survived colonial rule under Japan and before that the United States. If a landowner refused to sell his or her property to the military, commission officials exercised the power of eminent domain and filed a declaration of taking, followed by the depositing of money at the court to finalize the transfer. In addition, these officers acted with the belief that landowners had no recourse in resisting the condemnation of land. One senior member of the GLCC stated, "The power of a sovereign to appropriate for public use such lands as are necessary is inherent in the sovereign and cannot be questioned," end quote. Thus, colonial power that commission officials wielded was imbued in a legal apparatus that permitted the condemnation of privately owned land. Now, one of the most widely accepted claims in Guam history is what I call the liberation of land narrative, which argues that Chamorros willingly gifted or gave up their land to the U.S. military as an act of appreciation for the liberation of Guam. This narrative is problematic because it has been used to justify military land acquisition and has overshadowed other Chamorro narratives of land dispossession. Historian Ant Perez Hattori has argued that the military's hegemonic selection of land for condemnation, the inadequate compensation granted to landowners, and the management of land has all stimulated Chamorro dissatisfaction. Hattori's nuanced analysis accurately describes how many Chamorros gradually became upset with the military, but I also argue that coercion and fear played a major role in the usurpation of privately owned land on Guam. Many Chamorros were fearful of military and government officials, which influenced their interactions with them. In a November 1949 public hearing, attorney Frank Leon Guerrero stated, "Most of the Chamorros don't care anyway to argue with their government. It must be remembered that the people of Guam have been under military government for 3 centuries," end quote. During the same public hearing, U.S. Congressional Representative William Lemke stated, "There has been intimation here on the floor and a lot of information privately given to us that these Guamanians are afraid to oppose the government, that they are afraid even to speak up and give their honest convictions," end quote. For Lemke and other American officials, the idea that Chamorros were afraid of the U.S. government was foreign. However, for the people of Guam, this was a reality. Former Guam Senator and attorney Joaquin A. Perez claimed, "In Guam, the people have been trained by years of military occupation to respect and revere military men and other officers of the law. A request from the military was equivalent to a command, and no respectable Guamanian would think of denying anything the military asked for," end quote. These views highlight the prevailing sentiment that Chamorros were intimidated military and government officials, which was a result of living under colonial rule for 3 centuries. The fear of military authority translated into the advantage for GLCC officials when it came to land acquisition. Commission officials utilized various strategies to coerce property owners into selling their land. Felicita San Nicolas recalled her interaction with land and claim officials. Quote, "A military representative came to visit me and said, the military had reconsidered the issue and now only wanted to lease the land. This was satisfactory to me because I knew that one day I could get the land back and I would be able to farm it for the benefit of my family. What I didn't know, however, because I couldn't read English, was that the papers I was signing were for sale of the property. Only later did I find out the horrible mistake," end quote. The experiences of San Nicolas and others reveal that commission officials took advantage of the fact that Chamorros did not have sufficient language or reading skills to understand the documents they were signing. Besides these strategies, commission officials utilized other coercive measures that were more threatening. In the post-war era, many Chamorros began working as civilian military workers or enlisted soldiers, which also became a factor of coercion. Sirocco Sanchez recalled his father's negative encounter with commission officials. Quote, "When my father still continued to refuse, Mr. Kaminga threatened that my father could be court-martialed. As my father was in the Navy Reserve at the time, he became quite afraid because he didn't know how to protect himself and he didn't want to be thrown in jail or suffer disgrace," end quote. Aurelia Francisco's husband also suffered a similar fate to that of Sanchez's father. She claimed, "They would come out to my husband at his job at the Navy golf course and take him away from his work. They threatened to take him to court and told him that the Navy could put him in jail for refusing to sell. These threats simply became too much, so my husband agreed to sign the papers for sale," end quote. C.A. Pauno's quotation, coupled with experiences of Sanchez's father and Francisco's husband, reveals the deplorable strategies and harassment that commission officials used to acquire land. For landowners who were employees and men in the Navy, this placed them in a dilemma through the threat of incarceration and the loss of wages used to provide for their families. Thus, the experience of land loss was an emotional and fearful experience that generations of Chamorros would have to cope with. For many landowners, the loss of their land was also about emotional pain. Chamorro rights activist Ed Beneventi discussed the loss of his mother's rancho in Tizon. Beneventi said, "My mother always talked story about the memories she had farming and having family gatherings there. It was very emotional for her, especially since she would drive by the airport and she talked about the memories of her family's rancho," end quote. The Hoover Institute's report, coupled with Beneventi's interview, exemplifies that Chamorro relationships to the land was not predicated on economic gain. It also illustrates the emotional connection that Chamorros had to the land that was rooted in the memories of their ancestral lineage, family gatherings, and forced labor. In some cases, the U.S. military did return portions of unused land back to its original landowners or the government of Guam. However, the return of land did not guarantee permanent ownership. For example, in 1946, Jose de Leon requested that his home and land be returned to him since it was being illegally occupied by the dependents of a naval officer. The Navy decided that de Leon's claim was true, but also noted, quote, "It is expected that within a few days, authorization will be received for the acquisition of the land on which the house is located. It is recommended that Mr. De Leon be notified of the facts and urged not to press his claim," end quote. The military's overriding authority to confiscate De Leon's land dwarfed his short-lived victory in regaining ownership over his property. For some Chamorros, the return of the land did not guarantee it was returned in its pre-war condition. In some instances, fertile farmlands were returned as abandoned airfields, concrete pads, and or as asphalt runways. Director Harold Schwartz's memorandum shows that even when the U.S. military returned land to Chamorros, it did not guarantee them access to their property. In some instances, returned property was littered with large scraps of material that made agriculture and the construction of residences difficult to complete. Thus, the return of land did not ensure that it could be used for farming, which also forced Chamorros to rely on wage labor for subsistence. For most Chamorros who had their property confiscated, they preferred exchanges of their land instead of money. However, most landowners were instead forced to purchase new land with the case settlements they received. This encouraged Chamorros to think of land as a commodity to be sold and or purchased. According to Guam Assembly member Frank Perez, quote, "They, Chamorro landowners, would rather have another piece of property or land commiserate with the value of their land either in size or value for an exchange of government land." In the same hearing, attorney Frank Leon Guerrero's comments reflected a similar sentiment. In Agate, I was the defense counsel for property owners. None of my clients wanted monetary consideration. Everybody asked for an exchange in kind. That is the way our people look upon the value of land, end quote. Even though Chamorros were forced to accept cash settlements, Leon Guerrero and Perez's testimonies underscore that Chamorros attempted to continue the practice of land ownership rather than accept the commodification of land. In addition, the nature of some land takings was egregious enough to elucidate Chamorro and white American opposition. One of the earliest moments of Chamorro opposition to the military land taking in the post-war era came as a result of the military's attempt to make Tumon Beach an exclusive recreation area. On May 10, 1948, the Guam Congress issued a letter that stated, "It is felt by the members of the Guam Congress that all beaches and seas of Guam should be declared public property and that persons should have access to any of these areas either for recreation or for fishing purposes," end quote. Moreover, the military at times redistributed condemned land for private enterprise use. U.S. Secretary of the Navy John Kohler wrote, quote, "The assertions against the government of having used land acquired by condemnation for the purposes other than the public are to some extent true. There were some instances of individuals and firms entering upon and using condemned land without any formal right of occupancy," end quote. The statements of the Guam Congress and Dolores Coulter demonstrate that Chamorros became increasingly frustrated with the military's management of land on Guam, to harken back to historian Ann Perez Torres' argument earlier. A small group of white American writers such as Dolores Coulter, John Collier, Laura Thompson, and others were sympathetic to Chamorro objections to military land taking. The New York Times wrote, "6 months at the end of the war in the Pacific, the people of Guam are living in squalor. They are discouraged from even raising temporary shelters on land they own because the Navy may need that area later for military installations," end quote. In 1946, Collier noted, "The fact that revelatory of Navy misrule on Guam are derived directly and currently from Guamanians who know their own situation and from recently demobilized naval officer personnel, and not from a few of these, but from many." So essentially, American servicemen were also people who were observing the misuse of land on Guam, and they were also critical of the military itself. The observations of these American servicemen, coupled with white American writers, played an important role in increasing the visibility of economic and political conditions that negatively impacted the island and its people. With time running out, what I'll do is I'll go straight to the last couple slides. This map right here shows the different areas on Guam that land was that land was being occupied in the 1950s and 60s. And then what I end with this paper is that the land takings that occurred during World War II and immediately after basically motivated a lot of the young adults during the 70s to be involved in grassroots organizations that then opposed military land taking in the 70s and 80s. So it's documented that Chamorros had petitioned for U.S. citizenship and were concerned with issues over land throughout the 20th century, but it's not until the 70s and late 60s and early 70s that they become more reliant on using grassroots activism as a conduit to voice their objections and their concerns. So with that said, that's the last slide. So main arguments revisited, and then thanks to all the folks that helped. So.
Okay, sorry, buenas and afade, and yes, I did want to thank the Humanities Council for putting this great conference together. I studied the history of Chamorro music, a history that is characterized by a continual incorporation of foreign musical ideas. In hearing about this conference and its title, which very appropriately extends the idea of cultures in war into the period of World War II's aftermath. And I started to think about how so much of post-war Chamorro culture and music is rooted in the cultural milieu of these years, those years. The song I just started with is Michael Aguania's 1973 version of the Hank Snow song from 1952 called Married by the Bible. It exemplifies the way Chamorros use songs to express dissatisfaction with social change that came in post-war Guam. He uses a country song about secularism, social breakdown, and the decline of Christian values to make a Chamorro song that complains about the breakdown of Cristo Brun Chamorro. I've come to see how the proliferation of Chamorro renditions of early post-World War II American country songs in modern Chamorro music provides a window into the experiences of Chamorros whose lives have been transformed by war, its aftermath, and the multicultural environment that shaped cultural change going forward. Chamorro country songs have received little attention in post-World War II Chamorro cultural history. I believe that it is because they don't seem to fit into the dominant narratives that shape current understandings of post-World War II Guam. The 3 decades following World War II were a period of rapid modernization and Americanization, and of the marginalization of Chamorro language in Guam's public sphere. On the surface, it may seem that the Chamorro love of American country music affirms this, but it is important to note that there was never a time when Chamorros were not also translating these American country songs, replacing lyrics with ones that had more culturally specific meanings, and sometimes even using country songs as platforms to criticize Americanization and modernization. I've come to understand that despite common associations between a people's music and cultural nationalism, the Chamorro embrace of American music is, like such as country, cannot be completely understood within a nationalist or patriotic framework. I make the case that one must begin with the trauma of the massive physical, economic, political, and demographic transformation of the island that began when American forces returned to the Marianas in the summer of 1944. For Chamorros on Guam, the return of American forces was a time of jubilation and intense gratitude for liberation from an oppressive Japanese occupation. In the former Japanese mandates, the expulsion of Japan was greeted with ambivalence. Nevertheless, neither Chamorros on Guam nor Chamorros in the Marianas were American citizens yet, and they were not treated as such by the military. All Chamorros began the new American era with confinement. On Guam, it would be months, and for some more than a year, until the military resettled Chamorros into newly constructed villages wedged between newly constructed military bases. In Saipan, Chamorros and Carolinians were confined to refugee camps until 1946. For all, the immediate post-war years were a traumatic time of displacement and of uncertainty about the future. Vast areas of the islands were seized to make way for runways and Quonset huts, and in Guam, militarization continued to transform the landscape for years after the war, as the island became a permanent military fortress. If, as noted by scholars such as Robert Underwood and Ben Blas, the war reaffirmed indigenous identity by sharpening distinctions between islander and outsider, the summer of 1944 marked the beginning of an unprecedented onslaught of American culture of a particularly militarized variety, which would begin to blur distinctions between Chamorros and Americans. In Guam, 205,000 military personnel would be stationed on the island that year, and tens of thousands more would pass through the northern Marianas. As late as 1948 on Guam, the military still outnumbered civilians 68,000 to 25,000. And to this number were added as many as 10,000 civilian laborers. recruited from the Philippines and the United States, mostly from Texas. In Saipan, the military drawdown was more rapid, but the military would reassert control with the establishment of the Naval Technical Training Unit in the early 1950s. The sustained American presence would reshape the economy away from agricultural subsistence towards cash employment and economic dependence. When one speaks of music and war in Guam, it is usually the Japanese occupation and the moment of liberation that comes to mind. In fact, that is the only period in Guam history for which music has entered into historical and sociological analysis. Liberation on Guam is told as the story of a united Chamorro population that for 2 years and 9 months had pinned their hopes on the American return. Wartime songs of resistance expressed loyalty to the United States at all costs, and no song better exemplifies this sense of loyalty than the English language song, Sam, Sam, my dear Uncle Sam, won't you please come back to Guam? Other stories of songs shed light on the moment of liberation itself. War survivor Joe Guerrero recalls breaking into "Happy Days Are Here Again" as Marines led him out of Manengan. A woman named Miss Miller reportedly sang "Let Me Call You Sweetheart" during the same trek. Similarly, Silvina Charfers Tamamoa, suffering from rickets, rode with her infant brother Victor Charfers Cruz in their uncle's Carabao cart to the American camp at Fanili Agate. And she recalled the hillside rang out with a combination of Catholic Chamorro hymns and American songs like "Tenting on the Old Campground," "Just Before the Battle, Mother," "When Johnny Comes Marching Home," "God Bless America," and "My Country 'Tis of Thee." After settling at the Agate camp, Tamamoa was in the constant company of GIs who maintained the camps and often entertained the Chamorro children. She recalled learning to read by singing songs in the GI songbook, such as "Rock of Ages," "On the Old Rugged Cross," and other popular hymns and Southern folk songs. Such stories of music clearly express loyalty to the United States and a recognition that Guam's future was tied to America. But I also agree with Robert Underwood and Vicente Diaz's views that Chamorro appropriation of patriotic symbolism regarding the war can mask a subaltern, more inwardly focused Chamorro experience. American music in general seems to have been embraced on Guam because it was a symbol that the war was over and that as a community, Chamorros had survived. My own research has focused more on the music that expresses the experiences of Chamorros after that moment of liberation, as Chamorros began to adapt to the permanent economic, social, demographic, and political transformations of the Marianas. These islands were transformed during these years to meet the needs of the military, and one of those needs was entertainment. The first step in this direction was the establishment of Armed Forces Radio. The first AFRS station in the Mariana was WXLD KSI in Saipan, which began broadcasting in June of 1944 out of a tent using a mix of American and Japanese equipment. On Guam, the Armed Forces radio station WXLI Guam began broadcasting in October. An interesting aspect of AFRS during these years is that because of a musician strike in the United States between 1942 and 1944, no new music was made available to domestic audiences. Record companies did, however, allow artists to record on what became known as V-discs, which were only available to AFRS. Chamorros therefore heard the new releases of artists such as the Andrews Sisters, Perry Como, Bing Crosby, Tommy Dorsey, and dozens of others before it was even available to mainland audiences. It was also through these V-discs that a new wave of American country artists got their first international exposure through shows such as Melody Roundup, National Barn Dance, and AFRS Ranch House. I thought it was interesting, because of what I'm going to talk about later on, that this cartoon depiction, I don't know if you can really see it, but the bottom on top of that record, it says Great Speckled Bird, which is a Roy Acuff song from the time that would eventually be transformed by other country artists into a battle of the sexes between Hank Thompson and Kitty Wells. So some of you may be familiar with those songs. Radio was far from the only entertainment, however. USO shows brought some of the United States' most successful stars into the Marianas, where they entertained crowds of thousands. Movie houses, bars, and nightclubs sprung up everywhere on Guam. During the early post-war years, the military put considerable effort into keeping the different components of Guam society segregated. Military, civil service, Filipino laborers, and Chamorros all faced restrictions on movement around the island. For this reason, places like the village of Asan became important as a mixing zone between Chamorro populations surrounding bombed out Agana and sailors stationed at naval installations in the Upper Harbor area. Asan would be the site of the Asan Point Civil Service Center, as well as numerous locally owned restaurants and bars. Even with the seemingly strict segregation, boundaries were often crossed. Chamorros, after all, worked as civilian employees on the bases in various capacities, including as musicians in bars and nightclubs. Military personnel also found ways to bring Chamorro women to these clubs as dates. Sometimes these cross-cultural encounters were supported by the military establishment. Christina DeLisle has written, for example, of how even before the USO established a foothold on Guam, prominent Chamorro leader Akogare Johnson recruited busloads of beautiful women who performed Chamorro stick dances, Polynesian hula, and Chamorro renditions of Andrew Sisters and Shirley Temple. And this is Akogare Johnson on your right. A niece of Johnson recalled stories, apparently from later in the 1940s, of how Johnson would escort groups of young Chamorro women to the officers' clubs so that the guys could dance with the girls. A related perspective on the way boundaries in Guam's segregated society were easily crossed comes from local musician Jimmy Ferranti, who recalled that back in '47, he and then CB, but later Guam business mogul Ken Jones, were the Jitterbug Kings when jazz bands played at Harmon Bay, on Friday and Saturday nights. He explained in an interview that we would send armed guards to the villages to pick up the young ladies for the dances. The music of the era was, of course, big band swing, and the dance was the jitterbug. The era left a legacy of rhythm and a dance that remained part of the Chamorro celebrations for the rest of the century. It's less common today, but one will still see today's oldest manumpu, or elderly, get onto the dance floor when the DJ plays a jitterbug tune. No style of music from the era, however, would have a bigger impact on Chamorro music throughout the Marianas than American country. In fact, during my research, I interviewed dozens of Chamorro artists and fans, and the only music people seemed to associate with Armed Forces Radio was American country. I was actually quite surprised to learn upon reading the programming schedules of AFRS in the late 1940s that country music was only featured for a few hours each day. But there is some definite significance in the fact that the station is remembered as a country music station. Country music's heavy presence on Armed Forces Radio during these years was a novel development in American music history that was directly related to an ongoing cultural transformation in the mainland United States. The Great Depression and World War II had set in motion a mass migration of rural people out of agricultural areas in the American South as tenant farming collapsed and families were drawn by the thousands into shipyards and defense plants in the South, Midwest, and West Coast. Of course, military service also drew Americans out of rural enclaves. Military service also drew Americans out of rural enclaves. Country music historian Bill Malone writes that young Southerners, many of whom had scarcely been more than a few miles from the place they were born, marched off to training centers, carrying their musical taste with them. Barrack rooms reverberated with the sounds of guitars, lonesome rural voices, and the current hillbilly songs. Ultimately, they carried this music all over the world, including the Marianas. During the decade between 1945 and 1955, country music began to express new social messages as rural Americans adapted to life in urban environments where they confronted the competing value systems of a more complex and rapidly changing world. For Chamorros who were undergoing a similar, although in many ways even more complex struggle, adapting to the post-war American version of liberal, secular, capitalist modernity, the music seemed to tell their story, and they proceeded to make it their own. This would be especially true in the villages of southern Guam and in the northern Marianas, where Chamorro language and culture were perpetuated more systematically, and so the conflict with modernity was felt even more acutely. Country music historian George Lewis characterizes the genre during these years as a battlefield of cultural conflict and contradiction, triggered by the country music audience's engagement with social change. Songs about hardship, longing for a simpler time, the declining influence of religion in society, and various ways in which morality seemed to be breaking down held particular appeal for Chamorro listeners. Chamorro translations and adaptations of these early tunes, as well as later country hits, were perpetuated in informal settings throughout the 1950s and 60s. Adaptations and translations of country songs were often passed down to the next generation. When Chamorros began recording adaptations in the 1970s, many would be based on country songs of the early post-war years. In light of the centrality of the Chamorro mother in culture for centuries, Chamorro songs that praise them have an air of timelessness. But in reality, Chamorro songs such as Nanan Mami and dozens of others recorded by Chamorro musicians since the 70s were undoubtedly influenced by the mother songs that proliferated in country music as never before in the period between 1945 and 1955. Hank Snow's 1945 hit My Mother was one of the first of these songs that gained national popularity and was intensely familiar to post-war Chamorros. Both Chamorro and American versions of these types of songs recount the struggle that comes as people with large families and cultures adapted to agrarian societies struggle to feed and guide their children in an unfamiliar cash-based consumer society economy. Country music historian Bill Malone notes that mother praise songs reaffirmed the system of values that defined the older rural society and virtually deified the woman who had been the moral cornerstone of a vanishing world. In Chamorro songs, this would be articulated as a tension between Costumbran Chamorro, or Chamorro customs, and Costumbran Americano, which is American culture. Even if it was American country songs that provided the model. When Chamorros began recording, country songs and Chamorro songs about suffering were not restricted to stories of mothers. Among the most popular Chamorro songs about hardship is the Charfers Brothers' 1972 recording, Ipebli, for the poor man. The song's music is original and the lyrics are arguably original as well. The general theme of the song and several key lyrics are based on Hank Snow's 1956 song, These Hands, the story of a man who struggled his whole life and asked God not to judge him for his poverty. And yet, for writer Jesus Charfers, the song was a true representation of the life of his father, who had always been a poor farmer in the pre-war and Japanese era, and worked as a sanitation worker in the early post-war years. Ipebli is one of many Chamorro songs that mirrors Snow's imagery of hands, calloused and old, or in Chamorro, Kadzus Zanunku, and variations on that theme, common in country music, of hands and bodies worn out from a life of manual labor. These examples are just a sampling of Chamorro interpretations of American country songs that seem to express shared sentiments regarding the social transformation that was occurring during these years. Analysis of gender dynamics, the breakdown of various Costumbran Chamorro values, and the decline of Chamorro language and cultural traditions, and numerous songs about problems in personal relationships are all areas where one can find connections with American country songs. Of course, one of the primary themes in country music is that of longing for life in the countryside, a simple, idealized version of life that is out of reach in a modern world. World War II launched both Guam and rural America into a new era of irreversible social change and created an environment of cross-cultural interactions that changed life in the Marianas and the world forever. Thank you.